Hey everybody, it's Romania Black. Oh, we are on the mid-season finale of Moriarty the Patriot, The Two Detectives, Act 2. Technically it's episode 11, so you may be wondering, you're like, well, shouldn't the mid-season finale be episode 12? And apparently the season 1 only covered episodes 1 through 11, and then season 2 picked up after that. So I'm considering this the mid-season finale, and then we'll pick up episode 12. We'll start what technically is the second season, the second cour, but I'm probably going to keep on Patreon and YouTube just Moriarty the Patriot and not separate it by seasons, just because on Funimation it's literally episodes 1 through 24, so we're just going to keep them together. But I may have fangirled a little bit last episode. Sherlock is interesting, and some of you have pointed out in the comments on Patreon and on YouTube about how Moriarty, not only Moriarty, but Sherlock is a little bit different in the manga, that Sherlock is a little bit darker in the manga. Like, he lets some guys, like, harass Mrs. Hudson in the manga before Watson steps in to, like, test Watson, and I'm like, it's a little cruel. And then here, we get a little taste of it with Watson in the last episode, when he's, contemplating, like, I kind of would have killed that guy and let him, I would have shot him if it meant I got to figure out who it was. And so it kind of is interesting because on the one hand, what was so great about episode 9 was the fact that Sherlock stood up for the mystery and that he didn't want the easy answers. But whenever his leads start to get cold, you can see Sherlock become more frustrated and antsy, and he wants answers. And that's an interesting turn on Sherlock, him being impatient. And it's kind of a great foil for Moriarty because Moriarty is patient. Moriarty is very patient. So the fact that Sherlock is not patient and Moriarty is a nice little contrast between the two of them. Very similar to how Sherlock's personality is so outgoing and friendly and vibrant, especially when he's sociable, versus how Moriarty's like withdrawn and very stoic and quiet. But the flirting and banter between them, I mean, I felt sorry for Lewis because Lewis was totally the third wheel. He was just like, get me out of here. So I'm curious now because one, Watson seems like he's been stabbed. That's not good. There's a guy dead on the train. Whoever's the killer is at large. And Sherlock is making a game out of it. And Moriarty's like, sure. So I'm curious how this is going to get solved. The only thing I could think of is that there's a Sherlock story. We read it all the time in school. I think it was like the Gold Band, and in it a snake was going through the ventilation and like attacking people and like biting them, and that's what was killing them, and it kind of looked like a laceration. So I'm wondering if it's that, if it's like a snake going through the vent on the train, and that's what attacked Watson and what attacked that guy's neck. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. But that was the only Sherlock story I could think of that I was like, maybe it's connected to that, but I'm not sure. So I'm very curious. This version of Sherlock, I really like this version of Sherlock. The fact that he's more of a morally gray character, though, than our lawful good character that we would think of is interesting. Which I guess Lestrade is lawful good, and usually Sherlock is more chaotic good. But in this, he's kind of towing that chaotic neutral line, which is interesting. And then Watson, of course, is a true good character. So it's fascinating. But yeah, I am excited to dive into this episode, y'all, and see what happens. So it's going to be our last time with OP, so we need to enjoy it, right? And the last time with this Edie, which y'all have said, I've heard several of you say when I started the series, that the second OP and Edie are good too. So I'm sure they are. But we'll savor it in this episode. So let's dive in and see what all goes down, shall we? We're going to start episode 11 of Moriarty the Patriot, and we're going to start that here in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and let's go. Oh, Mycroft, huh? Oh man, there's a part of me that wondered going into the series. I'm like, are we gonna get Mycroft? Because Mycroft is Sherlock's brother, his dutiful older brother that in many adaptations works for the royal family and is much more serious and much more professional than our shenanigan causing Sherlock. And so I wondered starting the series, I'm like, are we gonna get Mycroft? I don't know if we will or not. And this Mycroft has definite Kuro Daddy vibes for sure. I had to look up his voice actor after. I was like, I know that voice. I know it. Oh, y'all. I know his voice actor best for 2 roles. One, he played Chad Sato on Bleach moons ago, but more recently, he's played Christopher from Yuri on Ice, Giametti, And he's also played in the most recent series that I've watched. He plays Kageyama in Twittering Birds Never Fly. And I was like, I knew that deep booming voice from somewhere, and it's Kageyama's voice actor. And I was like, oh, okay, it's from Twittering Birds. Cool. Nice. That deep voice is just so perfect for his character. And it's a great contrast to Sherlock, who's just all kind of frantic energy, right? This episode was really interesting. It's clearly the Mycroft tease is the mid-season tease, right? Of course it is. But this episode felt it was an odd episode. It wasn't quite it was just like a one and done case. And it didn't really lead into any, I mean, there's implications, especially with Lewis's conversation with Moriarty towards the end. But upon rewatch, when I was going back through to find the thumbnail real quick, I was like, oh yeah, there was a line that I missed. So yeah, so I'm glad Watson wasn't stabbed. I'm glad that he wasn't, and clearly at first before the OP, when everybody just kind of looked at him, I'm like, if he was injured, I'm like, don't you need to help him? But he wasn't injured, he just had blood on him. He was like, oh God, somebody just came at me with blood. And of course he was in a state of shock, he didn't know who it was. So that all makes sense. But there's a moment in this episode where right after Moriarty and Sherlock team up, and Sherlock's like, let's go, John. And then he realizes John's not there. It's really sad because it's like Sherlock clearly likes Watson as his partner. And you can tell that Sherlock feels bad for it. Sherlock is interesting in this episode because he gets his mystery fix, satisfied, right? Different versions of Sherlock have different addictions. Like in BBC's version, Sherlock is literally addicted to opioids. He's literally addicted to drugs in that version. And this one, it doesn't seem like he smokes, but he's not really addicted to the smoking necessarily. He's addicted literally to the mystery and figuring it out. And so leading up to episode 10, he hadn't been able to solve the mystery of who was behind the Noatic and who was behind Hope's crime. So it was driving him crazy that he couldn't get any leads and he couldn't figure it out. He just wanted to figure out who was behind it all. And Moriarty became that distraction for him because Moriarty's somebody that he views on equal terms intellectually. And he's like, oh yeah. And he figures it out. He figures out it's Moriarty like last episode, but he doesn't think that he doesn't have any way to prove it, right? It's just a hunch. It's just a hunch. He doesn't have any deductive evidence to prove it. And so when Moriarty does the catch me if you can, Holmes, if you want to prove it's me, you got to find a way to do it. And that like sparks Holmes' interest again. He's like, oh yeah, cool. So you can tell throughout this episode that he feels bad that he was that way towards Watson. And I love the bar scene at the end with them where he's trying to apologize, doing a really poor job of it, where he's like, maybe it's okay that you're hanging around with me. It's fine. Like he wants to apologize, but he's very proud. Sure, this version of Sherlock is very proud and he doesn't want to admit that he was wrong. And Watson's like, well, that was an apology. And I like that Watson kind of meets him halfway. He's like, well, the irony of all this is that, I told you if you're going to be a murderer, do it on your own. But if you hadn't solved this crime, I would have been labeled a murderer and probably would have gone on to trial for it. So he's like, I kind of owe you my life. So I'll compromise and let you smoke. Just don't get crazy. And he holds out the matches. And I love that Sherlock gives them the pat and everything. And so somebody's watching them in that last scene through the window. And it is not Mycroft. It's somebody else. I thought for a second it was Fred, but it seemed like their hair was lighter than that. Fred has dark hair and it seemed lighter hair. So I don't know who is watching them through the window, but someone has stolen the Queen's documents, and the Queen's documents have very important secret things involved, and so she doesn't want them getting out. So Mycroft, who clearly works for the royal family, of course he does, is being put on the scene, on the case, through any means necessary, no matter how ruthless. So that's interesting because, a part of me would be like, will Moriarty get involved in this? Right? Because if I think of ruthless in any means necessary, I think of Moriarty. So I wonder if Mycroft maybe does some digging around town, around London, and people are like, oh, well, if you want dirty deeds done dirt cheap, you go to Moriarty and his crew, and maybe Mycroft will enlist their help, and maybe by the by, Moriarty will enlist Sherlock to help him too, because he's like, well, you might be able to help me as well. And then it'll come out that Mycroft's Sherlock's brother, and Sherlock's probably like has resentment towards his brother, because that's always the big trope is Mycroft and Sherlock are always like butting heads like brothers do. And so that's going to be interesting if he tries to enlist. Because, yeah, I got very much at the end when she was like, no matter how ruthless, I was like, dirty deeds. Like Dirty Deeds was just playing in the background. And I'm like, is he going to go to Moriarty because he hears word on the street? Or, but that's interesting because if you think of the nobles, if that were to happen, the queen herself is like the noblest of the nobles. So I'm like, would Moriarty help out Mycroft if it meant helping out the queen? But again, not all nobles are being targeted. As many of you have pointed out in the comments, it's just the ones that have done ill will. So the queen would probably be okay to help unless these documents reveal she's done something awful, right? I don't know. That's interesting if that subject is going to get broached or not. But I'm really curious now whatever means necessary, what Mycroft ends up doing. Because I can't imagine, in all the iterations I've read of Sherlock, Mycroft does not usually go to Sherlock for help first, unless it's absolutely necessary. He kind of views Sherlock as an amateur and as lackadaisy and not professional enough to bother with. And Sherlock's like, I am professional, even though every other part of him is screaming otherwise. So that'll be interesting. But let me backtrack with this episode. I am sad this is the last time we got the OP and the ED. Very sad. So these transportation police, everybody kind of vies for Sherlock in this, which Sherlock was kind of, in a bad place last episode, but Moriarty kind of puts his reputation and the Moriarty name on the line. Lestrade puts his name on the line. Obviously, Watson's in jeopardy. So there are stakes added to this case, and they only have 45 minutes to solve it, which they solve it in 39 minutes. So, a quick old case for the Holmes and the Moriarty, right? So yeah, I felt bad that John was absent this episode, but I think clearly it helped Sherlock cement that he really likes Watson there, and he wants Watson to be around. And so it did cement that he really wants to have him there. And then they kind of split up, and we had Moriarty and Lewis do their thing, and we had Sherlock and Lestrade do their thing. So Lewis is interesting in this because Lewis points out a few things. He points out, one, that Moriarty, he's like, okay, my brother Moriarty William has established that Sherlock is just a pawn in all this. He's just a puppet for us to use to kind of be. Sherlock is not necessarily a scapegoat, but if they need somebody to distract with, Sherlock is the distraction because they can pin all these cases to him. They can send people his way. They can use Sherlock as a distraction while they go do their thing. And Lewis is aware of that. And he believes his brother is aware of that too. But Lewis points out that William is really familiar. Sherlock just calls him Liam. Doesn't even call him William. It's like they got pet names. They got nicknames already. I don't think Sherlock has a nickname yet from William's point of view. But Lewis is like, this man who's a pawn in our game is awfully familiar with my brother. And they're just, having fun and gallivanting around. And Moriarty kind of found excuses to be with Sherlock in this episode. Because as Lewis says at the beginning, they really didn't have any part to play. They could have just walked off and let Sherlock handle it. But Moriarty doesn't do that. He plays the game as well, which is interesting, right? So Lewis clearly does not like the fact that Sherlock is involved, and he doesn't like the fact that Moriarty is so close to him, because as he kind of points out, Moriarty's not really that close with anybody except Albert and Lewis. And so I got a little hint of some jealousy there, that Lewis was a little bit like, I don't want to share my brother with you, or, I'm sharing it with Albert and that's fine, but not with you. So that's going to be interesting moving forward to see if Lewis challenges Moriarty, if Moriarty keeps on playing up that he wants to be around Sherlock and have him involved more. Because Sherlock is like a time bomb. If Sherlock figures out that they are the ones responsible for all this, then he's going to try to turn him in. So that's, of course, Lewis would want to avoid that. So interesting. I like that Lewis is setting up his part in all of this and his viewpoint about it. The case itself, what I love about this series is that they come in and it's like Sherlock and Moriarty. They're both like, well, this is easy. Can't you all see it? And we, the audience, are like, not necessarily. And then once they start to explain it, it's like, oh, okay. Parts of it were pretty, you could kind of tell once they said that the drink was drugged, it's like, oh, okay. So it went awry. The guy ended up stabbing him out of panic. Tried to use the knife to get open the briefcase, didn't work, so he left and locked him in. Makes sense. After they did the deduction, it was a very straightforward case, which surprised me. I figured it would have a few more layers, but they were trying to solve it all in one episode and still have some room for this symbolism and layers in other places. So, and Mycroft had to show up. So, interesting. But yeah, Lewis makes the comment that he has his fists clenched. And he makes the comment that if things get out of hand, that he's pretty much going to kill Sherlock. Okay, sure, Lewis. You try that. Lewis clearly does not trust him, which is interesting because Sherlock is all about trust. And it's funny that Lewis doesn't trust him, but Moriarty says that Sherlock is far too trusting. So that's an interesting contrast between them. And William says that that's what he likes about him. He likes that he's trusting because it's kind of having that faith, That's interesting that he says that because his brother isn't trusting at all. So that's curious, right? Very interesting. And I'm wondering how that's going to go moving forward because Moriarty seems to enjoy Sherlock's company, or at least, and here's the funny thing about all, they both reach the same conclusion. We get Moriarty's perspective because he's our main character. We get his perspective, the way he describes the case, it makes sense that that's how they're solving it. It's like, okay, him and Sherlock are working it out the same way, that they're narrowing down to the 6 crewmen. They all got the muddy feet. So they narrowed it down to the shoe size. It was 2 of the 6. So then it's like, who has the bloody gloves? And the one guy clearly cut his hand to probably make it look like he had the knife, so he cut his hand to make it look like it was an injury. But here's the funny thing. Moriarty pricking his finger and putting little traces of blood on everyone's outfits. So here's kind of the underhanded thing about it. No matter who Sherlock had picked, Moriarty was going to use the blood that he planted on them as a safe insurance to convict them. That's the dirty deed. That's the underhanded thing. Like, Sherlock would not have done that. Sherlock would have, here, and his point, he brings up a really good point. He's like, Sherlock would not have done something against the law and underhanded like that. He would have stood by his conviction, taken that man to trial, and by the end of the trial, they probably would have convicted him guilty. And the result would have been the same. But Moriarty's way was just like expediting the process and being like, well, we didn't want to wait that long. We wanted to rule this guy out right now. So he's like, I'm not above it. Moriarty's like, I'm not above the law. I'm totally fine with doing this. But Sherlock would not have been. And so Lewis makes a really interesting statement with that at the very end there. He makes an interesting statement about all of that. And I want to find this in the episode itself. But he's basically saying, he's implying that Sherlock is not a strong person because he's so bound by the law and doing things ethically. That's what he's suggesting. And Moriarty's saying, well, that's not a bad thing for what we want to use him for. And I like that about him. I like that he's trusting, that he is trusting the system. He's trusting that things will work out. And so that's interesting. But yeah, Lewis takes the case and the fact that Moriarty solved it first as a sign that Sherlock is weaker than Moriarty. And Moriarty kind of says that's not really the case. They're both on equal footing, but Sherlock acts within the law and Moriarty does not. So he's like, we're both kind of on equal footing. We would have came to the same conclusion. We would have solved the case, and the client, based on our deductions and our techniques, would have ended up guilty all the same. But Moriarty's saying that I'm willing to go the extra distance to expedite the process, even if it's not ethical. So interesting, indeed. But yeah, and then we get this beautiful palace with like the ornate statues, and there's our queen with her black regalia and everything, and the black little veil, and then old Mycroft showing up. Yep. No matter whatever means you use, no matter how ruthless. And she looks very much like the queen in all the versions. But yeah, but him has a little bow tie. And you can tell he's very prim, proper, has the bow tie, the nice suit. It's all done up. It's exactly the opposite of Sherlock. Sherlock is messy, but not Mycroft Holmes. Sir Mycroft Holmes, a knighted man with his hair pulled back, has the same eyes and eyebrows. Same eyes and eyebrows and same face. But, nah, Mycroft's not to be messed with. I love it. So yeah, I love the banter between Sherlock and Moriarty. It's great. I love that they're able to get along so well together. It's kind of crazy. And then, yeah. And in that moment where he says, let's go, John, and realizes as soon as they're done investigating the crime scene and realizes he's not there, he has that little badger pout face. He has that little pouty face, like he's realized he's done goofed. And he's sad about it. But yeah, Moriarty notices that. So Moriarty notices that him and Watson are very close and that they're a pair. And I'm kind of afraid about that. I don't like that because back in the last couple episodes when they didn't know that Moriarty or that Watson was working with Sherlock, I was like, I don't want them to target Watson because Watson's so pure. But Moriarty knowing that Watson's important to Sherlock, I don't know if I like that because in other versions, Moriarty has used that to his advantage against Sherlock. So I don't know. I don't know how that's going to go. But yeah, pretty straightforward case. I like Sherlock slowly realizing everything he's done wrong, that he done goofed, and trying to work it out through to the end. Moriarty just being calm, cool, and collected and figuring it all out. Like having freaking tea while they have 30 minutes to solve a case. Like, we have time for tea. I've already figured it out. So yeah, I like the foils so far of Moriarty and Sherlock and how different they are, but they're both, like Lestrade makes the comment, he's like a mind to rival Sherlock's and his contemporary. Like up until now, Sherlock's not really had one of those. So of course Sherlock's obsessed. And Moriarty's kind of in the same vein because Albert's smart and Albert's ambitious and Albert's all aboard the William train, but Albert's not exactly the mastermind like Sherlock is. So there is a distinction there. So, and I like that we're setting up the dynamics of three here. We have Moriarty, Albert, and Lewis, and we have Sherlock, and you could say Sherlock, Watson, and Lestrade, or you could say Sherlock. I guess you could have four people there. You could have, well, right now, yeah, we have four. You have Moriarty, Lewis, and then you could say Moran and Albert, and you could have Lestrade and Watson and Hudson and Sherlock. So you have 4 and 4 there. And I guess if Fred's on this one side with Moriarty, then there's got to be a fifth person on Sherlock's side. And I don't know if that's Mycroft or if it's somebody else. So, because Mycroft doesn't really want to interact with his brother in the other versions of Sherlock. So curious. But yeah, I liked this episode. It didn't quite have like the epic, the epicness of like what you expect a mid-season finale to be. And if this is a finale for season 1, it wasn't quite as epic of a finale. But again, it's just mid-season. We still have another 13 episodes to go. But that reveal of Mycroft, that was very epic. I liked it a lot. So yeah, I'm very excited to see what all happens now that we're in the second cour, because we've set up Moriarty and Sherlock's relationship. We've set up Watson and Sherlock's relationship. We've set up, Sherlock's role in all of this. So now the dice has been cast and the Queen is getting Sherlock's brother involved. There's going to be bigger crimes. I'm sure it's going to all kind of ramp up from here. And I'm pretty excited about it. So I'm curious to know your thoughts down below. Please don't spoil me. I am going to read the manga eventually and probably do a soapbox about it. So I am excited about that. But otherwise, I hope y'all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care. And yeah, I'm excited. Next episode 12, we'll start technically season 2 of Moriarty the Patriot. I'll see y'all then, guys. Bye.